Good morning, everybody. Roll Tide. Appreciate you guys having me. Really appreciate the making all this possible, the Steiner family. It's just a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful series, and I'm honored to be a part of it. And I keep expressing my appreciation of the hospitality we've been extending. My family and I got my wife and daughter up there, Tanya and Zoe. It's just been great so far. We've obviously very familiar with Tuscaloosa, being graduates here. Love being able to come back home, if you will, and we're getting to see all the landmarks that are still here. We had breakfast at the Waysider, so that was great. But this place is a lot bigger than it was when we went to school here. So there's a lot going on in Tuscaloosa. It's always good to see. So what I'm going to do today is tell you about my book, 14th Colony. This is all about a British colony that was in existence at the time of the American Revolution that most people in general don't know all that much about. So it's sort of new history for a lot of people to find out that the Gulf Coast actually played a role in the American Revolution. So it's Alabama's connection. I think that's really fascinating, and so it's always fun to talk about it because most people are intrigued with that story and most people are not that very familiar with it. So today what I'll do is give you sort of an overview of all the major components of what I talk about in the book. We're not going to go into incredible detail and too much, but I'll aim to tell you who was here, why was there a colony, who was here, what were they doing, how did it end up playing a role in the Revolutionary War, what happened to it afterwards. So my goal is to give you kind of this general overview where you have just enough knowledge that you feel like you know something about it, and maybe encourage you to do a little bit more reading on your own to learn about it. Now the first thing I'll mention before I start is why is it called 14th Colony? It's not because it's sequentially the 14th founded. We know the story of the American Revolution. We know 13 colonies established in the United States. 13 is a very familiar number to us. So if I say 14, it sounds like there's something extra. That's what this is about. When I was writing this book, there was another gentleman writing about the colony of East Florida, which was founded at the same time. It's basically the Florida Peninsula. But I always joke, my book came out first. So West Florida is our 14th colony. So let me start with the story of why was there a 14th colony? Why was it here? What was going on? So again, we're going to kind of hit the highlights on some of these things so we can understand what this is all about. So the reason there is a colony on the Gulf Coast that the British owned called West Florida had everything to do with a war that was not fought here. 7 Years' War, we call it French and Indian War. Not fought locally, but it was fought between France and Great Britain and their allies, and it's sort of a world war. And the consequence of it ended up that the French lost their place in colonial North America. They lost the war, they lost a lot of land, and there was a lot of land swaps going on in North America. So if you look on the map on the left, is before that war, 1754. You look on the map on the right, that's what the colonial landholdings, or claims I should say, looked like in North America by the European powers. And you will notice that huge swath of this pink, peach, not sure which color you call that, that represents French landholdings. You see what they held before, you know, Mobile, New Orleans, all those areas, French landholdings. Well, after the war, you don't see that. That was the cost of them losing the war. They gave up that. And one of the beneficiaries of that land acquisition was the victors in the war, and that's the Great Britain. You see that yellow color, which is not usually what you think about with British, but anyway, that's the map. You see there's a huge acquisition of territory as a result of that war. And you also notice, if you look down the Gulf Coast, you see that Florida changed hands. There's some changing colors, so there's a lot of land swap. The one big story that we're going to focus on today, out of the many we could from that map, is what did the British do with this new acquisition they made on the Gulf Coast, what we know today as the Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi area. They created 2 new colonies out of it. This is West Florida, that was one of the colonies. At the same time, they created East Florida. I'm going to come back to a better map of this in a second, but East Florida is basically the Florida Peninsula. West Florida stretched from the Mississippi River in the west to the Apalachicola River in the east, Gulf Coast in the south, and the 31st parallel in the north. That was the original boundary in 1763. We recognize the 31st parallel still with us today, correct? First time that line was on maps. That is still with us as part of the Alabama-Florida border, part of the Louisiana-Mississippi border, but that was the original northern border. The year after the colony was created, the local government officials were already petitioning London to move that border further north because there were no competing European claims to the land. The best agricultural land is actually not on the Gulf Coast, it's further into the river systems. And they were asking to move it as far north as almost where the Tennessee state line is today. Now the government in London said, no, we're not going to do that, but what we'll do is meet you halfway, and we agree we can move the colony's northern border up to the 32nd parallel, 28 minutes. Sort of sounds like an arbitrary line. Does anybody have any idea, looking on that map, what might be at 32nd parallel, 28 minutes? Easy to find landmark you didn't need a GPS for back in the day. This is where the cliffs, the bluffs of Vicksburg are. Vicksburg National Military Park is where the Yazoo River enters the Mississippi. It was a well-known geographic reference point, and they just moved the border up to that point and then just drew it from west to east or east to west, how you want to look at it. And so this is the extent of the colony by 1764. So this is West Florida in its entirety. This is what it would look like during the American Revolution. This is what it would look like when it ultimately changed hands into Spanish control. So that entire landmass ultimately, as you can see on the map, embraces half of Alabama, half of Mississippi, a little bit of Southeast Louisiana and Northwest Florida. That is the story we're talking about today. The American Revolutionary experience for this entire region is this British colony of West Florida. Now, when the British sent the first officials to take over the post that were in West Florida, they obviously were a little bit discouraged from the quote that you can see on there of what they had first encountered. That they, just like any other British citizens of the time, may have been looking on maps, and they would have recognized that the primary communities in this new colony had been around a long time. Mobile and Pensacola, well established, familiar spots on the map. Few had actually been to them. What they had hoped would happen is they would arrive and find these thriving riverside or bayside communities. There's a change of flag and we're under a new ownership. What they discovered is they had to create a colony almost from scratch. Mobile and Pensacola, neither one of them were over 300 residents. These were struggling communities, not really vibrant economically, dependent on the military fortifications. And as Robert Farmer, famously sent to Mobile, said, it's the most disagreeable and unhealthy place in America. He went further to say it's only good as a graveyard for British people. These are people that were not acclimated to Gulf Coast weather, and they arrive in the middle of hurricane season. So this is not an auspicious start, but they realize they've got to dig in and begin to lay the fundamentals for the groundwork of what would become a colony. The same thing happened over in Pensacola. Frederick Haldeman said, he can't find anything good to say about Pensacola except there's a sea breeze he could occasionally enjoy. He famously wrote to his wife that said, one summer in Pensacola will make you yearn for a lifetime of the ice of Canada. So rough start. But to their credit, the folks sent here went about developing that colony and really had a lot of support out of London to do so. There was a permanent lobbyist stage there. A lot of plans were made for what this place could become. This is the Castile of the province of West Florida. They set about creating a functioning government, which was headquartered in Pensacola, had the first representative form of government on the Gulf Coast. You had an appointed governor who had an appointed council that when he called the legislature into session would serve as the upper house. So they had elected members of the lower body of the legislature. Now, the only trick in understanding all that is they only assembled when the governor called the legislature into session. So these were not regularly occurring events. So the legislature only met 7 times during the colony's existence, which is one of the several reasons that we probably don't know as much about West Florida. No newspapers were published in the colony. The legislature doesn't meet every year. It's well off the beaten path. You don't have regular communication as far as goods and information between the other seaboard colonies. So this place, the British who are sent here or arriving here or getting land grants here, truly felt this was the ragged edge of civilization in the British Empire, with reason. So there's lots of reasons that it sort of flies beneath our radar when we talk about revolutionary America. And they, at the time, would have certainly felt that way. But nonetheless, some very important things to consider when they were going about creating a new government. Capital was at Pensacola, stayed at Pensacola. There was some talk of holding legislative sessions in Mobile because those were the two primary communities, the largest communities, very close together. But they never held the actual sessions in Mobile, much to the consternation of the citizens of Mobile. If you look back at the legislative records, there's quite a lot of discussion of how they would really like that government to actually meet in Mobile, but never did, stayed at Pensacola. Went through a series of governors. I'm not going to tell you about all of them. I'll tell you about the first and the last. The first, George Johnstone, wanted the job, laid the foundations for the path the colony would pursue as it developed. So we're talking better roads, land grants, getting reasoned people to come there, improve the economy, improve the fortifications. The problem was he couldn't get along with anybody. Everybody hated him. And at one point, his own honor guard, sort of like the Secret Service of the day, got so frustrated with him, they locked him out of his own house, forced him to scale the walls of the fort to get in. And they were already writing to London saying, please send us somebody more agreeable. And they did. They went through a series of governors. One everybody liked. He was there for about a month. And then after a dinner one night, he went and hung himself. Another who took his place was actually, at the time, under investigation for embezzlement of government funds, got into a duel, shot somebody. So he was almost under investigation for murder and embezzlement at the same time before you finally get Governor Peter Chester in there, who sort of calmed the political waters. You can see by the years on the screen there, he was the governor for most of the colony's existence and sort of calmed the political waters, and really under his leadership and the relative calmness that he brought, you see the colony actually begin to grow. Now, one of the things that was a primary concern for the government, especially during this day, is what's depicted on this screen. The primary economic exchange that most people are more immediately concerned with than anything else at the time, the thing that makes the most money for some of these first settlers, is trade with Native Americans. And this is what's represented on the screen. So a lot of the energy of West Florida's governmental processes are concerning how to regulate, monitor, and just control the trade that's happening, because there's a lot of ways that could go bad very quickly. Now, at this particular time, you got to understand that this little window in Southeastern history is a very tight window in which this trade was probably most beneficial for both sides, and it was before or after. We know that afterwards it's certainly not. So what's happening is the Europeans are bringing in all sorts of manufactured items that native groups very highly prized. They had grown very accustomed to European manufactured items, tools, axes, metal, cloth, things like that, firearms. And the British had the best supply of all those, and they wanted those. And so one of the several reasons they didn't do anything to kick the British out. It wasn't like they were forcefully making their way in there. They negotiated their way in, and they were kind of welcome as a trading partner in some ways. What the Native Americans were bringing to the table are one of the most highly prized for this window of time trade items that the Europeans had access to, and that is deer skins. Now, it would not be that way for very long, but at the time, deer skins were being sent to Europe by the hundreds of thousands every year. We're talking almost a mass depopulation of white-tailed deer in the Southeast. This is a commodity that's being transformed into sort of a cheap leather of the day. Leggings, hats, book bindings, gloves. These things are in demand. The Native Americans have them, and the British have the trade goods, and there is the partnership. And that is going to define the economic interaction between these two groups at the time. Now, other settlers who are making their way to the colony from other European countries and mostly from other British colonies, they're going to be engaged in something that you probably would assume even if you don't know anything about the time period: agriculture. They're trying to make a living off the land. So they're growing everything from corn to chickpeas to rice. And they are, in small numbers, bringing in, a few of them, enslaved Africans. And there some are getting to the colony and then purchasing slaves from the neighboring colony of Louisiana. But this is the very beginnings of a form of agricultural and plantation economics that's going to be a huge part of Southeastern history later, but this is where it's just making its beginnings. Most people are on pretty small farms. A lot of cattle and herding is going on. All these new communities are year-round markets for milk and meat and butter. So herding was a big activity. Tobacco was a major cash crop of the day, so people are trying to plant tobacco and get into those international markets, and you probably can assume correctly that more and better tobacco was produced elsewhere in North America. We don't think of the Gulf Coast as a primary tobacco region, so think more of the Chesapeake. Had a little leg up on the folks trying to do that here. They also tried their hand at indigo, which was a very lucrative crop at the time. Indigo, of course, is the dye that you get from processing the indigo plant. A lot of intensive sort of investment made to ultimately process this. Takes a lot of manpower, a lot of know-how, and there was effort to do it in West Florida. And there were a few planters that made a good amount of money on it. But by and large, it was not the one true path to wealth that they had hoped. Remember, this is the generation, or two generations really, before the invention of the cotton gin. So cotton was grown in very small quantities. There was really no way to make it produced on a wide scale that you would see in just a short period after this. So they're looking for that cash crop. There's never one that's truly found that can be relied on. But what was happening was in a few decades, within about a decade really, you began to see the colony develop as an agricultural colony the way that Great Britain had planned. It's showing the beginnings of it. This is a map of the Mobile-Tensaw Delta just north of the city of Mobile. You can see the rivers snaking through there, the Tensaw River especially. And what you see in all those rectangles are land holdings. So these are places, concessions, where planters are either setting up homesteads, clearing them out of the timber and then beginning to farm, or they're sending hired labor or some points enslaved labor to do that. So the very beginnings of an agricultural economy are starting to happen within just a few years of the colony's establishment. This is a map drawn in 1772. Remember, the colony was created in 1763. So this idea of an agricultural colony, which is what they had envisioned for West Florida, was beginning to happen slowly but surely. Now, some of the best land in the colony was actually over on the Mississippi River, what we call the Natchez District today. That was recognized as probably some of the best soil in the entire area. So a lot of the new folks that are coming in and getting land, they're going to come through Mobile and Pensacola, but Mobile and Pensacola are not really going to grow as urban communities very much. People are coming in and they're immediately going out. This is a rural agricultural colony. And a lot of folks by 1780, half of the population is going to be living in these rural regions, no real big city. Natchez had just beginning to be laid out and formed as a community, but scattered up and down the Mississippi Valley. You've got a corridor settlement that about half of the population of the entire colony is there. Excuse me. Now, I will mention real quick, just for reference, when we talk about our final military component of all this, between the Mississippi and Mobile, you've of course got what we know today as the Mississippi Gulf Coast. That is not a primary area of settlement. There are certainly settlers there, but there's no major single community. Now just remember that as the settlement pattern, because that'll come into play when we talk about the military campaigns. Now, I do like to mention to folks that when we talk about settlement, sometimes we have in our mind's eye, we just think, oh, it's a change of address. We're going to load up the things and arrive. It was a little bit more difficult than that, and poor Matthew Phelps just is one terrible example of how bad it could be. The poor guy was coming from the Northeast, had heard about the land, how great it was. They're being offered almost for free, enormous tracts of land in West Florida. So he determined he was going to take his family with him, and went with a caravan of other settlers, several families, going to make this trek down to this new homestead in West Florida. And they get down there, and along the route, People fall out. His poor wife dies, becomes sick, dies. They continue on. His poor children drown in the Mississippi River. The guy has no choice, but what do I do now? He continues on. He gets to finally, at length, after this long, harrowing journey that I talk about in the book, and he arrives at the plot of land that had been allotted to him, and to his consternation, he finds somebody else had already set up a home on it. So it's just a series of disasters that can happen. It's not an easy change of address. But nonetheless, people were taking advantage of these free land offerings. And not everybody had the experience of him, but he just shows you how difficult some of these migrations could be. Now, so once they arrived, they began to build some homes. This would have actually been a representative of one of the more wealthy planters in the area. This would have been a very elaborate homestead. Now, this is actually standing today. Don't know how many from you are familiar with the Krebs House in Pascagoula. That's what it is. Anybody heard of that? Dates to the 1770s. So this is of the time period. We don't have very much architecture in the Southeast of the time period. This is one of the few that dates to approximately that. It was added onto after that, but this gives you an idea of what the planter elite, if you will, would have been living at. So again, we're talking about a few generations before the White Column Revival, Greek Revival mansions of the Antebellum South. Most of the people arriving here would have been living in much more modest farmsteads, homesteads, even single-room cabins, such as this one, which is this is a depiction of a very simple farmer cabin on Dauphin Island. You see a little outbuilding in the back, little fence. This was actually distributed in Europe as a information piece about the colony of West Florida that the British were hoping to encourage immigration to, and they could give away these free land grants. But I always joke at this one that this is not Chamber of Commerce material. The French had named Dauphin Island Massacre Island because they stepped ashore and found a lot of bones. And so here's a lovely view of the cottage on Island Massacre. Doesn't sound like the place that you're jumping to move to. Another thing that points to what investment the British were making in trying to develop the colony is this rather bizarre attempt to change the route of the Mississippi River from going to the port of New Orleans, which is in Spanish territory, to flowing into West Florida. Great idea. Wouldn't it be great if the outlet of this major continent-wide waterway drained through this new colony? So they went about this Herculean effort here to dig a man-made ditch across the Iberville River, which is basically a small ditch near Baton Rouge, and have that drain into the Emmett River. And from there on to the Lake Maurepas, on to Lake Pontchartrain, they actually sold town lots for two new towns they planned to develop on this major new international trade corridor. Of course, they don't exist today. The river flows like it flows at the time, down through the port of New Orleans, owned by the Spanish at the time. But I always point to that to show that this was not a colonial enterprise that the British government just let lay waste. Sometimes it's perceived that it was just this struggling little place that there were no plans for. That is one of the things that show you there were some hopes and aspirations for this, but it didn't pan out, largely owing to time. So 1763, the colony is founded. We've got some population stats. About a year or two later, about 2,000 people, non-Indian population, were residing in the colony. All these efforts I'm talking about to encourage land holding, to encourage immigration, to encourage trade, have resulted in an increase of the population. It had more than doubled. That sounds like a great percentage. It had doubled to about 5,500 people. Think about the landmass we're talking about. It is still a very small colony. Now, had it been allowed to continue on that course of development, of course, things would have been a lot different. But as it was, something called the American Revolution is going to happen. It's going to change everything in the colony, bring a lot to a standstill, ultimately result in a change of ownership of the colony. Every time I do this presentation, I'll stop and ask if anybody knows much about Revolutionary history, what is the youngest of the colonies, the 13 that were part of the rebellion? established United States? Anybody know the date of the last founding? It's Georgia. Georgia. And when was it founded? 1730s. Okay, so that is still a good half century, give or take, a few years, before the Revolution. So even the youngest of our colonies who formed the country had a long time to begin to establish their own economic patterns, settlement patterns, trade, routes. There's a lot that goes into establishing a community. Well, West Florida, remember, had been around a full dozen years before this, was still very much in the very infant stages of developing all these systems when this thing hits. And so the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about how it impacted, especially the military operations that a lot of people don't realize happened largely between the Spanish and the British, but nonetheless affected the course of the Revolution, and talk about how people reacted to it. So this is a map of the major military campaigns in the American Revolution. No specific event here I'm going to call your attention to. You don't have to be able to tell me where Valley Forge was to know that in general, the American Revolution was fought north and east of where we are. We don't associate this with being a major military theater, but yet there were some very significant actions that we'll talk about. Now, the colony of West Florida was solicited to participate in the Continental Congress. They received the invitation. They did not respond by saying, no, we love our British homeland, long live the king. They didn't respond in any way at all. They literally let it lie on the table. That's what they said. I'm going to explain why they did not participate in a very quick sort of generalized statement that scholars of the period could point with a few details about to take issue with. But in general, most people in West Florida at the time heard bits and pieces of what was happening elsewhere. No regular communication. And they thought it was sort of somebody else's problem. How is that going to affect us here? That you don't have the same level of knowledge or interest in the things that are driving the rebellion as they do in the seaboard colonies. This is a different situation. You've got an inordinate number of people living in the colony that are in the direct employment of the British government. You've got more soldiers than citizens in some of these communities. This is not a place that has had the time to develop the infrastructure that's going to be riled up by what's happening in other colonies. So there were some exceptions to all this, but in general, this place just wants to stay out of the war. Sees it as somebody else's local concern. They don't even quite able to follow it thoroughly because you don't have regular ships sailing between the Atlantic seaports and places like Mobile and Pensacola. The information you get is very old, and you're kind of getting a piecemeal story, and it sounds like a concern of local citizens. Now, there was some discussion in places like Mobile about things like the Stamp Act, which even George Johnstone, the governor at the time, had heard about some grumblings about this and said that people were talking about in the streets if this was right or wrong. So we do know that there was some awareness and discussion of some of the major factors that we recognize on that timeline leading to the American Revolution, but clearly it was not as a front burner issue the way it was in some other colonies. The British actually were very, very secure in what they thought would happen in West Florida. If it stays out of the Revolution, that's great. If it was ever threatened, they really thought that the local citizens would still be attached to their homeland and rise up and fight with them to repel any invader. But as it turned out, as we'll see, that the British, General John Campbell said, the people here are without public spirit. In other words, they really, truly want to stay neutral in all this, and they're not going to rise up and participate in this willingly. So this is a situation that made West Florida a very attractive destination for some people during the American Revolution. If you know anything about the Revolution, you know that we think about the war as between the Patriots and British soldiers, but in truth, it's neighbor versus neighbor in a lot of cases. People are choosing sides, if they're loyalists or patriots, so there's a Civil War component to this, and there's a lot of people in Georgia and the Carolinas who are truly being caught up in a war zone, and they're in the middle of some of this stuff, and they're looking for a way out. And the British government can look around, they see all the chaos in the other colonies, and they saw that West Florida is just safe and secure and far away, and they need settlers anyway, so they declare it to be a secure asylum for persecuted loyalists, and they extend very generous land grants for people who want to move here. So ironically, during the revolution itself, you get a small influx of people that are moving to get away from that war zone, coming to West Florida. They receive nice land grants, 100 acres for themselves, 50 acres for every wife and child, indentured servant or slave. So if you want to get out of a little bit of a chaotic situation and you really don't want to become embroiled in a war, and they're going to offer you some Gulf Coast property for really nothing at all, a lot of people took advantage of that. And so that only solidifies West Florida's desire to stay out of this conflict. Now, there are two major military campaigns that we're going to end with talking about. One is a very brief one that I'm just going to mention in passing. I've got a chapter on it in the book, but it is interesting. It's very small, but it's the one campaign that brought American soldiers to the Gulf Coast, and where there's actually any interaction between American soldiers and the British in the Gulf Coast. That is Willing's Raid. I don't know how many people are familiar with this. James Willing, quick backstory, had lived in the Natchez area, well connected in American government circles up in Pennsylvania. He was originally from that area, and he had moved back, and during the Revolution, he heard some of the discussions that were taking place in the Continental Congress about how wonderful it would be if the Revolution could be prosecuted and the United States could win its independence, and they could look on the map and said, boy, it'd be great if we could own some ports on the Gulf Coast. You know, we've got this body of down here and people not really participating. Maybe there's some way that we could insert ourselves there. Long story short, there was never the political or the financial or the practical ability to really make something like that happen. The folks who were really involved in fighting the British Army had some serious reservations about trying to open up a new front for people who really weren't volunteering to fight either way. But James Willing inserted himself, saw an opportunity. He asked the Congress, he said, if you would give me a few men and a ship, I'll go down there and I'll do some important stuff that would help our cause. I'll make sure that the pipeline between Spain, which owned New Orleans, and George Washington Army is open. I'll make sure that West Florida stays out of the war so the resources they have are not going to be brought to bear for the British against the American government. And they give him a ship, ironically named the Rattle Trap, and they give him 50 guys, and he goes down the Mississippi River, and I'm going to just kind of sum up this, what could be a longer story. He conducts a raid. He conducts a raid and he robs plantations, and he goes to New Orleans with a plan to sell it all. Kind of devolves into this chaotic mission. And the upshot of all of it is that it brought to the attention of the British in West Florida and the Spanish in New Orleans that there might actually be a serious break and altercation between those two communities forthcoming. Got to remember, these are two countries that are on opposite sides of a lot of things diplomatically. They were not officially supposed to trade with each other. They both perceived themselves to be pretty far removed from the main colonial enterprises of their respective countries, and they had both sort of looked the other way on trade rules, etc. So there are actually British traders from West Florida operating not only in New Orleans, but even stationed their boats on the Mississippi River in New Orleans, things that weren't officially supposed to happen. It was very obvious after that raid that that pattern was not going to be able to hold up very long. Spain was getting interested in what was happening in the American Revolution. Bernardo de Galvez is the new governor, very well connected with his home government, very well connected in Spanish political circles from a very prominent family, and his arrival and his attachment and his understanding of what's going on in his home government is going to be very different from what had come before. So Galvez knew his home country was considering joining the American Revolution in some way. Everybody knows France helped us. They helped win the United States independence. France was asking, begging, pulling, pleading Spain to join them. They did not want to be the only European power fighting against the British in this. They were hoping Spain would join them. Even George Washington himself noted that France's help is going to be crucial, instrumental, but if we could have Spain join against the British, that might tip the balance, having Spain in their power to open up yet another front. Galvez knew his home country was very reluctant to endorse American independence. They own colonies just like the British. And the idea of encouraging one rebellion while trying to keep control of your colonies was not the best precedent to set. But they really wanted to get back at the British for losses in the 7 Years' War. They really wanted to get back at the British for a series of things they had been at odds on for a long time. It's a traditional rival. Great Britain was distracted. Every resource they had was devoted to fighting Washington. They thought this was the perfect opportunity to take advantage of that confusion. And he knew his home government was about to declare war on Great Britain. Not officially endorse American independence, but declare a war on Great Britain. So rather than sit idly by and wait and respond and react, he proactively organized a plan for what he would do once war was declared. And what that involved was a proactive campaign to go from New Orleans up to the West Florida border, knock out the British West Florida defenses in sort of a lightning strike, if you will. And that's exactly what he did. Marching through the swamps, there's a wonderful depiction of his armies making their way up toward Baton Rouge. They arrive at Baton Rouge. Well, actually, first they arrived at this little fortification called Fort Butte. They captured it a few miles upriver. They get to Baton Rouge, which is a much more substantial British fortification. They capture it after a short siege. They force the commander there to throw in the surrender of Fort Panmure up in Natchez, which is a long way away, but they nonetheless force that surrender. So in this first whirlwind campaign, while the British government back in West Florida at Pensacola is sitting saying, what do we do now that Spain's declared war? He's already taken out all of their defenses on the Mississippi River, all in Spanish hands before the British could even react. And not only that, he's already gone back to New Orleans and was recruiting and preparing for a second campaign that would target Mobile. Remember, between the Mississippi, we talked about the map earlier, between the Mississippi and Mobile, you've got the Mississippi Gulf Coast, but you don't have major communities. The next target's going to be Mobile, going west to east. If he captures Mobile, he's already effectively captured more than 2/3 of the colony in just 2 quick campaigns. So that's what his goal is going to be. He's got a very diverse force. He makes his way, and this is jumping around really fast, but he makes his way towards Mobile. They're going to arrive at Mobile and conduct a short siege of the place. They're going to enter into Mobile Bay at that's Mobile Point. That's Fort Morgan. Damn the torpedoes, Civil War. A few generations before, this is where the Spanish set up a little temporary fortification on that shore during this campaign. So you have this Spanish presence much earlier. This is very sensitive for some reason. So they're going to make their way into Mobile Bay. Not a secret. The British know they're coming. It's kind of hard to hide a Spanish fleet in Mobile Bay and a large army. So they knew they were coming. They just didn't have much to resist them with. They arrive, go up south of the city at the Dog River. They make it a pretty determined stand despite being severely outnumbered. The British at Fort Charlotte in Mobile are really just hoping to buy time for a relief column to come from Pensacola, which gets there a day late and $1 short. It's a few weeks of a siege. This is a contemporary map of the ships going into Mobile Bay. This is a map focusing in on the fort, which if you're familiar with downtown Mobile, you probably heard of Fort Condé, right downtown. I don't know how familiar any of you are with Mobile, but at the top center, the little lines that you see up there, that's the Spanish fortification that they took a while to set up, and then they opened fire on this place. Up Government Street, if you're familiar with it, that's where the Carnival Museum is, roughly. That's where the fortification. So they were in close proximity. They opened the guns. It's a long siege. It's a one-day battle. By the end of the first day, the Spanish were blowing holes through the wall at Fort Charlotte large enough for men to walk through, they say. So the white flag goes up by the end of the day. The relief column is just out in the distance. They hear the bombardment, but they're not close enough to do anything about it. It is a very consequential battle in terms of territorial gain. It allowed Spain to now control 2/3 of the colony, major riverways going into the interior, and it isolated Pensacola. It is no Gettysburg in terms of numbers, though. There's one guy each side killed. The poor gentleman on the Spanish side who lost his life, he wasn't even killed by gunfire. He was killed when a tree he was chopping down went the wrong way. So it's not militarily a gigantic battle, but strategically it allows Spain to have a huge portion of this colony under its control. So Galvez goes back to New Orleans. Everybody knows he's preparing for this final campaign that's going to target Pensacola. That's the only part of West Florida that's still in British hands by 1780. So while he does this, he leaves a very small force on the eastern shore, a little community called the Village, a little crossroads community. So it's the beginnings of what we know as Daphne, Alabama today. He leaves that force there to inform him of what the British are doing as he's preparing for this final campaign. The British realize this is their one last chance. Everything in this war has gone against them. They've been caught off guard at every step. They see this small fortification, less than 200 guys. Galvez is back hundreds of miles away. This is their one chance to capture that little fortification, retake control of Mobile, and thwart Galvez and what everybody knows is going to be his final campaign targeting Pensacola. So they're going to send against that. Some naval ships are going to come into Mobile Bay, cut off any chance of resupply of the fortification from the west. They're going to send an army overland, come from Pensacola to the Village, going across what is now Baldwin County. A lot of those soldiers are German mercenary soldiers, Waldeckers. They do have some allied native forces, and they're going to lay attack to the Village in what will become a fairly large battle, much larger than the battle that actually occurred in Mobile, and try to attack it at dawn on a foggy morning in January of 1781, and they are almost successful. Almost being the key word. They attacked it. The Spaniards, to quote one of them in the defenses, said, "Rather than run, we determined to sell our lives dearly." So they stayed, they fought. They ultimately, after it had rained the day before, so it took them a while to dry out the fuses for the cannon. But once they got everything ready, it became a battle of one larger force that was outside a wall and another with artillery inside one. And the British realized their best chance of surprise had already passed. They didn't have the forces to take the fort by force. They have to retreat. And they go back to Pensacola. And hot on their heels are Galvez and his army, which by that time was beginning to make its move towards Pensacola. And we have a historic marker now in Village Point Park in Daphne, we're glad to say. Baldwin County Historic Development Commission put up. And at Blakeley, Historic Blakeley Park, most people know it as a Civil War park, but we are nearby. We're just a few miles away from where this happened, and we now have a yearly reenactment of all things Revolutionary War battle in Alabama. So it's a lot of fun to do that, very educational. Had a great crowd this year, a lot of learning opportunities to share that story. So this leads us to our very last campaign. This is where our story is going to end about British West Florida. Galvez and his army are coming, and they're coming to isolate and capture the last piece of British West Florida that's in British hands. That's Pensacola, the capital. He makes his way to Pensacola Bay. He very famously sort of shames the Spanish fleet that had joined him to make the way into the bay. The Spanish fleet was hesitant about going in. Didn't know where the depth of the channel, where guns were, etc. Galvez said, "Okay, if you won't go, I'll go in and lead the way with the 3 little boats that I command from the colony of Louisiana." And he famously enters the bay, forces them to follow in the hell of gunfire. After the battle, I don't know how many people are familiar with the phrase Yo Solo, have ever heard that associated with him. This is sort of his claim to fame. On his coat of arms, after the war, this is literally a new panel on this guy's coat of arms. And if you can make any of that out, the panel shows a ship with one guy on the back leading the way, and above it a little banner says Yo Solo, I alone. So this sort of makes his name for himself with this. The folks in Spain that are interested in American Revolution know a lot more about it than most Americans do. But he makes his way into the bay, and they begin a long siege, drastically outnumbering the British. And the siege of Pensacola, March to May. It's a long siege, day by day fighting. It's not for one position, it's for multiple positions around Pensacola and Pensacola Bay. So it's a really complex operation. A lot goes on day by day. I'm going to sum it up for you. Basically, the Spanish are getting closer and closer. The British are more and more isolated, fewer and fewer supplies. They're on a difficult end of a long siege that they know is going to culminate against them unless something drastic happens. The drastic thing that happened did not work in Spain in British favor. What happened was that the Spanish had gotten to almost within point blank range of some of the fortifications. They were lobbing mortar shells from one fortification to another. You know, big, just lob a shell up, falls down short distance ahead. One of those shells on May 8, 1781, made its way into one of the fortifications just as they were literally opening the powder magazine to begin to return fire on the Spaniards. Boom. No fortification left. When the smoke cleared, they realized they were surrounded and most of their largest fortification was gone. So they raised the white flag. Spain has conquered every fortification in British West Florida. British West Florida is now Spanish West Florida. And if you've been to Pensacola, I don't know, has anybody seen this? Palafox Avenue, if you're ever there. Wonderful equestrian statue of Mr. Galvez, just a stone's throw of where what I just told you about happened. And around the base of this monument are short depictions of the battles I just told you about. So the whole campaign is sort of represented there in Pensacola. So at that point, British West Florida is now Spanish West Florida. This is one of the first maps produced of the new United States. The United States recognizes that this is now Spanish property, makes no attempt to take over the entirety of West Florida. However, they do have a disagreement with the Spanish about where that border lies. Remember the very beginning of the presentation, we talked about the 31st parallel was where the original line was, then they moved it up. Spain obviously wanted to keep that boundary at the northernmost point and worked to do that for about 15 years. The United States kept pressuring them to move it back down to their original boundary. Spain was actually on the decline as a world power, and they ultimately agreed to do that. So they moved from this northernmost line in 1798 down to the 31st parallel. That disputed tract right there was immediately annexed by the federal government, created a new territory out of it called the Mississippi Territory. And that's where we begin our story as the origins of the states of Mississippi and Alabama. And that brings us to an end to the story of British West Florida. That's a whirlwind overview of a forgotten colonial entity. I hope that you've learned some of the basics. I know I move fast in a lot of the details, but it's a fascinating story and it is our local direct connection to what was happening in America's bid for independence. And it's a unique one. It's not exactly like some of the other states, but it's ours, and I think it's something that we should be interested in learning about and commemorating. And I appreciate your attention in doing a little bit of that today. I don't know if we have time for questions. Yeah, be glad to take any questions I can on it. Appreciate your attention.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
You said there were four, when they set up the initial government, there were 4 districts or sending delegates.
Yeah.
Mobile, Pensacola, there were 2 others.
Manchac and Campbelltown. Okay, Manchac is basically Baton Rouge, south of Baton Rouge. It was a population center. Campbelltown was just outside of Pensacola. It actually shows up on this map if you can see it where Pensacola is. I can't quite reach up there between O and R. Little community is basically of French Protestants who were looking for some asylum, and the British government needed some settlers and basically gave them a huge plot of land and let them establish their community. But very shortly after that, they realized that land wasn't all that good. Pensacola was a better location, and Campbelltown was only in existence as a functioning community a very, very short time. And the plans were, as the place grew and other settlements came online, that they would be granted this. So you got a growing legislative body. It just, time didn't work out that they had very many more to add. Yes, sir.
As the colony was being formed, you mentioned the British built roads. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. Truly, they built only one that was consistently maintained, that was reliable, and that was the road between the village, Daphne, Alabama, and Pensacola. There were some local roads, especially on the Mississippi River corridor, that connected some of the settlements, no major communities, especially outside of Natchez, that connected points of settlement. Not really a lot of serious road building outside of that. Those are the two areas that had roads of any length that were maintained for any length of time. There were short roads in other places, but these are sort of local settler maintained roads. The one that's truly a government endeavor that they actually maintain is that one connecting Pensacola. So basically, it's the road effectively connecting the two largest cities. Pensacola, you connect the eastern shore, and there's a ferry that takes you across ahead of Mobile Bay.
I have one question that comes from more later history. I grew up in Panama City, Florida.
Yeah.
The basement side. But because of that, I know St. Joseph, or Point St. Joe, where the Apalachicola River comes in, was one of the best ports. And yet it seems like for both the British and the Spanish, it wasn't.
It didn't connect with interior settlements and agricultural producing regions at the time. Now later on, it would become, Apalachicola would be the third largest port on the Gulf for a lot of years, but that's a antebellum phenomenon once cotton production takes off. So at the time, we're talking about the Alabama River system. So a lot of the early settlement of the West Florida interior is going to be just north of Mobile, Alabama and Targbibby River systems, and on the Mississippi. So those are the two that are where people are producing things that are going to be exported. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Some of the maps that you showed that depicted land grants of relatively small amount of acreage.
Yeah.
But weren't there massive land grants?
Yes.
For some families?
There were some, and that was a bit of a sore point with some locals because there were a lot of people well positioned in the British government that were given or acquired 5,000, 10,000 acre tracts that they never came to settle on. It was, they were acquiring something that they knew they could sell at a later point. And they were not making any effort to actually cultivate it. And that was supposed to be one of the conditions. You were going to be given these tracts, but you were expected to improve it in some way. And so the settlers had the smaller grants were like, why are these guys, these wealthy guys, getting these huge tracts? So there were. What I showed you is just north of Mobile, where there were active cultivated efforts, areas where there's actually farmers and actually trade on that corridor going on. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the relationship with the natives was largely as trade partners, and and the colonists were welcomed. Did that change with the changes in who was controlling the territory and with the development in agriculture?
Yeah, it's going to drastically change in the years after, and it's going to change a little bit within the time period depending on who's there. So I'll give you a quick story. In general, now these are just in general, I'm not getting to all the incidents because not every interaction between the Creeks and the British was positive. George Johnstone, the first governor, was sort of a hothead, and he misinterpreted some of the original communications between the Creeks and the Choctaws who had been working with the French. When he arrived there, the French had been there previously, and they expected, okay, they came and meet, it's like, are you going to continue to do what they did, which is basically give us gifts, and we have these annual discussions, and we talk about trade. And he got a little bit frustrated with some of their demands, and he's summarily writing to people like, okay, send this message out that this is the way we're going to do it, and if you don't like it and you're ready for war, we're ready. And that got back to London. They said, this guy's going to get this colony destroyed with that attitude. So in general, though, the expectation was the British had this wonderful supply of things they wanted. These are things that Creeks and Choctaws wanted. The British had the best supply. And if they could all work together, everybody would be happy. The natives didn't have an idea that in a generation later there'd be huge settlements way north of Mobile and Pensacola. They said at the time, this could work well for both of us. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of details that could go on both sides of that. But in general, that was a relationship. And it would quickly sour as you go forward in time with what's happening and the influx that you get of Americans after Spanish takeover. And Spain actually encourages American immigration because they are hoping that because they have a very small army, very few resources, they want to maintain their presence, and they know they don't have settlers to come do it, but they said we could give the land to all these Americans who will be happy to have it. We can be friendly with them. They'll love our lenient government, and this colony can form a barrier to them taking things that we want. We can kind of form a block, but stop American immigration that we don't want. And it's all going to go sideways and very badly for the Native communities after that. So I'm talking specifically here about this 15-year window of time in which that vision of trade was actually working fairly well. So.
If you'll forgive me for moving a little farther along in time, do you feel like the relationships with the Native Americans then carried over somewhat into the early American Mississippi Territory area, resulting in such things as Fort Mims?
Well, there's definitely a connection, direct connection between that, and it really is the connection between, more than anything, the Spanish period and the influx of Americans and what they expected and demanded. Because almost as soon as Spain was allowing and encouraging, accepting American migration, and even in the cases they weren't right on that international border, Americans are coming far down, and they immediately begin pressuring the American government to say, why are we allowing Spain? We've got all this territory, all the rivers, and then the very mouth of the rivers, we're letting a foreign country control it? That becomes a sticking point extraordinarily early in the next generation of European ownership, and it leads to a variety of things. This whole area, the first chunk of West Florida that's forcibly taken, if you don't count what we established as the Mississippi Territory, that results from an American revolt where they basically took over a Spanish fort at Baton Rouge. And then during War of 1812, we just took a huge chunk of the Gulf Coast, including Mobile, and then we forced the Spanish to surrender the rest of Florida in 1819. So the beginnings of this forceful takeover happened in the Spanish period. If that answers your question. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned Campbelltown, and there's been some speculation on where it's actually located. I don't believe the actual remnants have been found, correct?
Judith Bentz will tell you otherwise. Yes, she's pretty convinced she's found it. A long-time archaeologist at West Florida. And I'm not proficient enough to say the exact location, but she's given a presentation too. I think we've got a good idea exactly where that is. Yeah. It's right outside of, basically it's North Pensacola. It's right outside town. Other questions?
One last. Well,
Yeah.
I have your expertise, maybe Dr. Thompson's. In the territory of Mississippi, eventually split up, Mississippi, Alabama, 1817. In 1819, Alabama became a state. In some of the readings I've done, I don't think it was in your volume, but I know I have read somewhere that in the early 1800s, early days of the state of Alabama and the state of Florida offered West Florida, Pensacola, I don't know how far east, offered it to the state of Alabama, and the governor of Alabama turned down the offer. Nothing down there but Indians and...
So it was nothing but a bunch of gopher holes. That's what he said.
So am I correct that
Yeah.
did happen?
That did happen, and then there was one effort, I can't remember when the first one happened, but even at statehood there was an effort to discuss that. Should we make a move for that? There was an actual formal effort as late as the 1880s where there was discussions, and first one was initiated by Florida, then there's a second one, the Alabama government revisited it, and they all just thought it's not good farmland, a bunch of gopher holes. They did not have the foresight to think of what would be on the Redneck Riviera with taxation at that time, but they missed quite an opportunity. So I've been asked about that a lot, about how this ultimately ends all of it being incorporated into American states. I call it the Americanization of the Gulf Coast. I got a presentation on that one too. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it.